Good afternoon. We're so excited to have you folks in our session. We thank you for the great introduction of us and our project. And today we are going to be taking our time to talk about Cache Creek and really focusing on what it takes to gain support for new public open space. Super excited about our panel. Our panel of experts. It spans the depth and breadth of what it takes to put a project like this together, from design to long-term planning to implementation, management, and maintenance of facilities like this. So we have a great group. We have a lot of information to get through. What's neat about it is all of us have worked over 20 years in our respective professions, and we've been working together over 5 years on just this project together. So why Cache Creek? Cache Creek is not unlike many valley projects in the rural areas where there's really complicated property and mining right and land use issues along such a jewel of an open space such as Cache Creek. And so what's great about this project is we, as a team, have been through a lot of the challenges and issues and hope to be able to share that with you folks to take back to your respective projects that are similar to this. To give you a little bit of background on where it's at, Cache Creek is the outflow of the Clear Lake watershed. It's, you can see it's west of Sacramento, and it spans from Clear Lake, Lakeport area to that lake, dumps out into Cache Creek, and then it flows over to the Sacramento River. The area that we focus on, much of the upper part in the foothills is already beautiful open space. The area we're focusing on is along the flatland area where a lot of the mining is taken place. And so we've broken up our presentation into 3 sections, which is really focusing on the past, present, and future. Lisa's going to focus on the present from the county's perspective. What is it like to implement this plan? What's this in place? How do you fund it? Those types of things. I'm going to talk about the future, which is how do you visualize what a great resource this will be when it's all done. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Heidi. That's going to talk about the past and really the importance of working with the landowners and miners to get this baked into the planning process early.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to join this panel today. I'm a land use planner by trade, so to start us off, let me just put this out there. Mining is a very challenging land use. I've worked on 22 mining applications in 5 counties, and they are always controversial. But here's the thing. Everything we need, depend on, and use is either grown or mined, so we need this land use. I think another point worth acknowledging is that unlike other land uses, mining can only occur where the resource exists. And this gets me to Cache Creek. This part of the creek that we're talking about today is Lower Cache Creek, as you saw on Ben's map. This is a distinct river segment and watershed area that extends from a small dam near the Yolo County town of Capay to approximately Interstate 505 near the small town of Yolo. There's been commercial mining in Lower Cache Creek for over 140 years, and this is because Cache Creek has a very large, valuable aggregate deposit. It was gravel from Lower Cache Creek that rebuilt San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, and it was Cache Creek aggregate as well that was used to construct the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s. So when you have a land use like this, how do you manage it? Well, while mining is a challenge, it's also a land use unicorn. It's the only land use that requires planning for use after obsolescence. And it's the only industry that is required to create a whole new natural landscape once completed. So with that, let me give you some background on our program. In the 1970s through the 1990s, this was a period in Yolo County often referred to as the gravel wars. Keep in mind that the cultural backdrop was the emerging environmental consciousness during this era. This was when CEQA, NEPA, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, SMARA, and a host of other seminal environmental laws were passed at the federal and state level. Mining in Cache Creek was vested. Regulatory agencies wanted mining out of the creek. Environmentalists wanted the creek restored. Farmers wanted to preserve agriculture. The county wanted regulatory stability and control, and the aggregate producers wanted certainty, and I think maybe out of the bullseye. So the political planets were aligned. After some time on the issue without gaining ground, I was hired by the county to oversee a process to guide the transition from in-channel mining to a highly regulated off-channel mining program. It was a unique collaboration of government and industry. The CCAP is written like a mini general plan for mining and creek restoration. And for you land use planners out there, it was actually adopted as a specific plan. It was based on an extensive scientific study of geomorphology, hydrology, and biology of the lower Cache Creek area. And by being science-based, it helped change the conversation from one that was stuck in arguments over facts to one focused on finding a solution. Rather than looking at isolated mining sites and disjointed reclamation, the plan embraced a watershed approach, meaning consideration of literally the entire watershed of the lower Cache Creek area. Integral to the plan is the concept of adaptive management, which is the idea that you modify your program and approach as you go based on what you've learned along the way. This was achieved through an extensive program of monitoring and reporting. The plan was written to balance a number of overlapping and sometimes competing interests. It actually contained chapters called elements, just like a general plan, that addressed each of these key topics that you see here: aggregate resources, water resources, floodway and channel stability, agricultural resources, biological resources, and open space and recreation. Mining permits are basically conditional use permits. Compliance with the policies and regulations in the plan is achieved through conditions of approval and execution of contracts called development agreements. Together, these allow for three unique features of this plan, which are the CCAP superpowers: net gains, which is the concept of special public benefits; operator equity, which is the idea of ensuring a level playing field between the operators; and self-funding in the form of protected, ongoing, per ton sold fees. Here are some basic facts about the plan. It was adopted in 1996 after a 15-month whirlwind process. It covers over 28,000 acres along 15 linear miles of lower Cache Creek, and it includes a mineral deposit of close to 1 billion tons of the highest grade aggregate. The plan has always had a 50-year outlook, and in 2019, we undertook a comprehensive update that included extending the horizon year through 2068. The CCAP has two main components to it: the off-channel mining plan, which focuses on off-channel mining within the area shown here between the yellow and the blue. The actual area of approved mining is about 1,900 acres and 7 sites, with no more than about 2,300 acres identified for mining in the future. In other words, the mining is limited to about 16% of the entire mineral deposit. The mining permits are limited to 30 years, and all approvals include both annual and total caps on tons mined and tons sold. The OCMP is implemented through the county's mining and reclamation ordinances. It includes performance standards and design criteria that go well beyond SMARA, which is the state's mining regulation. The program also includes rigorous inspections, monitoring, and compliance review. The second component of the plan is the Cache Creek Resources Management Plan, which focuses on creek restoration in channel. This area covers almost 2,300 acres, which are shown here in the blue. The CCRMP includes the Cache Creek Improvement Program, which identifies creek maintenance and stabilization goals and designs and required in-channel monitoring. The CCRMP is implemented through the county's in-channel maintenance ordinance and flood protection ordinance, and it's advised by a technical advisory committee comprised of a fluvial geomorphologist, a hydrologist, and a riparian biologist. This program includes an annual creek inspection called the Creek Walk, monitoring of things like sediment discharge, bed load, water quality, vegetation, channel form, and water surface elevations, and an annual report on creek conditions, which feeds into the adaptive management. Development agreements are contracts between the county and the operator. And we have identically structured agreements with every operator for each mining operation. And these agreements commit the mining companies to the 10-year reopeners that allow us to integrate what we learn from the annual monitoring and for new applicable regulations. They also commit the operators to the per ton fees which fund the entire program and various additional public benefits which we refer to as net gains. Net gains are a Yolo County creation that are critical to this program. Nexus and CEQA basically get you whole or close to whole with regard to impacts from a mining operation. The idea with net gains is that there should be public benefits that go beyond getting even and actually result in true additional benefits to the local community in exchange for carrying the burden of that land use. Again, for the land use planners out there, you know that state law precludes us from going beyond Nexus or CEQA in project conditions. So the only way to get to net community benefits is through a development agreement. And in Yolo County, these additional public benefits have come to include primarily land dedications, trails, extra funding, and public access. It's the net gain concept that allows us to create this parkway. In 1996, we laid out the groundwork for it in the CCAP, but without details and without a plan. We recognized it was just too heavy a lift at the time on top of the other controversies. It segments the activation of the parkway based on acquisition timing and property location to allow us to open up the parkway features logically and efficiently. And finally, it validated our per ton fee program as being adequate to fund operations and maintenance over time. I'll stop here and turn it over to Elisa to discuss implementation.
Thank you so much, Heidi. As you just learned, Yolo County will be receiving about 1,900 acres in net gains property dedications in the near future. With the prospect of these properties coming into the county's inventory, it was critical to put a plan together. As you're all aware, a plan is only useful if it accomplishes its intended purpose. To ensure that our parkway plan would be useful and consistent with the county's policies, we had to ensure that it was demonstrating consistency with the general plan and the Cache Creek area plan, that it clearly articulated the management of open space and recreation along Lower Cache Creek in detail, as well as described the ultimate vision for full build out of the parkway in concept. The plan also needed to include specifications, including site-specific opportunities and constraints related to development, access, and end use, as well as connectivity to ensure that we end up with an integrated trail system. The Parkway Plan was also crafted to guide future development agreement negotiations for modified or additional net gains. As Heidi mentioned, we are currently processing an application for a new mining operation, as well as applications to modify 3 operations, all of which will result in improved net gains or new net gain properties coming into our system. For example, the Parkway Plan identifies gaps in contiguous ownership and therefore public access. County staff can prioritize the filling in of those gap properties over, say, perhaps an expansion at an existing net gain property when advantageous to do so. Finally, and I will talk more about this in a little bit, an additional component of the Parkway Plan is that it identifies specific properties that are well suited for low or very moderate intensity recreational uses, and where the county can donate voluntary habitat conservation easements to the benefit of the Yolo Habitat Conservation Plan and Natural Communities Conservation Plan, which is a suite of state and federal incidental take permits that streamline the mitigation process for development within Yolo County and its 4 cities. The county reached agreement to work with the Yolo Habitat Conservancy to identify properties where it can dedicate easements in exchange for the Habitat Conservancy assuming long-term maintenance obligation for those parcels. So here it is in all its glory. This is the cover of the Parkway Plan. As a result of the extended timeline of the Cache Creek Area Plan, keep in mind that it's typically 20 to 30 years from the time of negotiation of a net gain property until the time in which the county will receive the property. We have the gift of time on our side when it comes to planning. Pay close attention to the photo on the left side of your screen. You can all see the beautiful wetlands and the boardwalk with the overlook, right? These photos show that same property. On the left is a photo from when it was actively being mined for sand and gravel during the 1980s. And on the right is a photo of the same site from a slightly different vantage point while it was undergoing reclamation to its end use, which are the wetlands that you can now find at the 120-acre Cache Creek Nature Preserve, one of our net gains dedications. The Cache Creek Nature Preserve is frequently referred to as the crown jewel of the Parkway. If you ever find yourself in Woodland, do yourself a favor and check it out. There's no fee to visit the nature preserve. The preserve also contains a small educational center with wildlife exhibits as well as Native American cultural artifacts. In fact, the site also contains a tending and gathering garden that is designed by and maintained by Native American cultural practitioners to ensure that they have the plants and herbs that they use in their traditional diet and medicinal practices. There is also an integrated trail system that is designed to highlight the myriad of native ecosystems present on the site, which are wetlands, riparian, oak woodlands, and grasslands. The preserve hosts outdoor education events for school-age children, as well as classes for all ages and abilities, including yoga, photography, painting, poetry, bird species identification, and native storytelling exercises. It's a perfect example of successful implementation of the Cache Creek Area Plan, highlighting all of these values: environmental, cultural, historical, and recreational. With the benefit of a 20+ year planning horizon for most parkway properties, proper planning has allowed the county to respond to the desires of its residents. In 2016, prior to the development of this parkway plan, we conducted a larger study called the Yolo County Park Sustainability Study. This sustainability study looked at both the physical and financial sustainability of the county's entire park system, of which this parkway is just one component. One key component of the sustainability plan was the extensive outreach and surveys of residents and visitors as to their recreational desires. Through this outreach, it became obvious here that there were 3 key takeaways. Everyone, and I mean everyone, wanted a nice restroom, and no one enjoys portable or primitive restrooms. That was one takeaway. The second takeaway is that the most highly desired recreational uses were water-based recreation and camping opportunities, which is really interesting because the county, though surrounded by water between Clear Lake, Indian Valley Reservoir, Sacramento River, Cache Creek, Puda Creek, and our many, many creeks and sloughs, does not have any naturally occurring lake features. So it's very encouraging to us as practitioners to receive feedback that the lakes that we are creating as part of the Cache Creek Area Plan are a desired recreational feature. Third, there were emerging recreational activities that we hadn't even thought of, such as disc golf and geocaching. Having this fresh data available, we were able to integrate these recreational desires into the Parkway Plan's development. Another benefit of the planning horizon is that it has allowed the county to build a financial reserve and to plan for the activation of parkway properties in an orderly fashion. We have also had time to build a shared understanding of the public's desires as well as concerns related to increased recreational activity in and along Cache Creek. This early identification of public concerns has allowed county staff to coordinate with experts and respond with well-crafted policies and procedures to address these concerns. For example, when county staff were doing outreach to the landowners along Lower Cache Creek, one theme that we noticed was there was an overarching concern amongst these landowners that opening up all of these acres to the public would end up resulting in increased homeless encampments along the waterway, much like you see in Sacramento. We were able to take these concerns and work with our law enforcement partners as well as our homeless outreach strike teams in our Health and Human Services Agency, and we were able to put together training materials and protocols, which we can use to train our park staff as well as our docents on what to do if in fact they do encounter unsheltered people or homeless encampments. Finally, the planning horizon has allowed the county to adapt to the rapidly evolving regulatory climate, particularly related to threatened and endangered species. When new species are listed as threatened or endangered, and they happen to reside in Yolo County, chances are pretty good that they or their necessary habitat can be found within the thousands of acres of the Cache Creek Area Plan. We have also had time to build partnerships with many stakeholders, including other government agencies, nonprofits, local schools, the Farm Bureau, and landowners along the creek. These partnerships include the gravel mining companies that pay into the program, of course. The Parkway Plan has resulted in streamlined negotiations with the gravel companies because the needs of the parkway are clearly articulated in an approved document. The Parkway Plan ensures that all parties are reading from the same page, so to speak. These relationships, combined with the adaptability of the program, have led to some truly unique projects with outcomes that allow all partners to win. And I will tell you more about one such project in a few moments. But first, we have to answer the question that we get asked most frequently. I honestly can't tell you how often I get asked the following question. Yeah, Ely, so this all sounds great, very cool, but be honest, who's going to pay for all this? I've worked in local government for over 20 years, and it's not very often that as a staff person, you get to say, this is fully self-funded. As part of the Cache Creek Area Plan, the county collects a fee on every ton of gravel sold. That fee is currently set at 64 cents per ton. The fee revenue averages about $1.4 million per year in revenue. As shown here, about 17% of the fee goes to the off-channel mining plan fund, which is then used to regulate the mining operations. About 56% of the fee goes into the Cache Creek Resources Management Plan fund, which, as Heidi described, the multitude of uses of that program earlier, but one of those approved uses is recreation. About 4.4% of the fee goes into what we call the Maintenance and Remediation Fund. Sometimes we call it our Rainy Day Fund. This fund was specifically created with an eye towards addressing perhaps unforeseen environmental consequences of the mining program. However, in the near future, within a few short years, the balance of that fund will become available for implementation of the Parkway Plan. And finally, about 22% of the fee revenue goes to the Cache Creek Conservancy, a 501(c) nonprofit that was specifically established as a result of the Cache Creek Area Plan. And the Cache Creek Conservancy is charged with restoration and environmental education activities in and along Lower Cache Creek. That is their mission. Even though we do have a dedicated revenue source for the Parkway Plan, it doesn't mean that all of our problems are magically solved. We still have regular program costs such as salaries and program upkeep, plus many projects actually exceed the revenue of the program, such as the project to replace the headquarters building at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve. As I mentioned, we take in about $1.4 million a year in revenue. However, replacing the headquarters building looks like it's going to cost somewhere between $5 and $6 million. So we still need to plan and create reserves and look at other options for funding. Having the revenue stream combined with the activation schedule that was created as part of the Parkway Plan allows for this careful planning to occur, the setting aside of reserve funding for these capital improvement, and gives us the ability to borrow funds if necessary. I know it's not as pretty to look at as the colorful maps, but my personal favorite part of the Parkway Plan is this appendix that the team put together. It compiled estimates of probable construction costs, and I swear to you that this appendix is a veritable treasure trove of information. Not only does it provide conservative estimates of the costs associated with activating each Parkway property or each Parkway property segment, it breaks them down into line items. With this information at our fingertips, we're able to spend much less time and effort preparing grant applications. We're able to budget for improvements and replacements in an organized manner. And finally, we're able to leverage funding opportunities by determining whether it's more prudent, by utilizing efficiencies associated with the natural construction process, to invest in improving a single property as opposed to an entire segment of the parkway. For example, if we had a parcel we wanted to construct a restroom at, and that one single property, it might actually be to our benefit and advantageous to expand the scope of the project to include bids for restroom construction at multiple parkway properties where they are needed, because it could be the case that the per unit cost is reduced by the increased volume of construction. And we have a lot of options when we have information like this. Just a few minutes ago, we talked about the valuable partnerships that we have formed through the implementation of both the Cache Creek Area Plan and the Cache Creek Parkway Plan. As we invest our time and resources in our program areas, such as recreation, habitat restoration, cultural or historic preservation, or environmental education, partnerships begin to naturally emerge based on shared interests. For example, when we're working on a project with a recreational theme, we will likely be working with our Yolo County Parks Department, with Tuolumne and other nonprofits that were created just for recreational purposes, with the Yolo Audubon Society, and with private vendors such as rafting companies or campground operators that have a shared interest in expanding recreational opportunities along Cache Creek. You may also recall that I mentioned that our robust partnerships have allowed us to be creative and develop win-win-win solutions. And now I'd really like to share one such success story with you. This project is a perfect example of what we've been talking about. The property you're looking at is called the Woodland Reef property. It was mined from the 1970s through the 1990s. I know it's hard to see from this aerial, but the majority of the parcel is shaped like a bowl, as one would expect land that was mined to be shaped, like a bathtub. This 120-acre parcel was dedicated to the county as a new net gain about 4 years ago. It's mostly open grassland with some high-quality riparian along the creek, which is shown in blue on this graphic. Interesting side note about this property. The levee along the creek was intentionally left to breach about 5 years ago. Upon the advice of our technical advisory committee, which Heidi described very well earlier, and the breach was left intentionally to allow for more natural creek processes to evolve at this site. The breach allows for the property to flood in high flood events, which results in lower peak flood elevations within Cache Creek, as well as the natural placement of additional soils within the site, which helps speed up the restoration of the site. The area shown in red on the top right is reserved as a development envelope and will contain a parking lot, restrooms, and other basic infrastructure and amenities. The remainder of the site will be used for mitigation or conservation of either Swainson's hawk habitat or elderberry habitat. The Swainson's hawk habitat area, which is the green area, will be used to mitigate for a portion of a mining operation, as well as for the county's own construction of the Esparto Aquatic Center. The yellow areas have recently been planted with elderberry shrubs that were transplanted from the Cape Ay Valley as part of the expansion of the Cache Creek Casino Resort. This slide is showing you some on-the-ground photos of the same site, the Woodland Reef property. On the left are volunteers from the Cache Creek Conservancy. On the right are transplanted elderberries. And on top is a photo of the site from 2019 when it was flooded, as the breach intended. It is clear that we are implementing the goals of the program and the Parkway Plan, while we are still creating wins for our partners all the way around. So let's highlight the winners that evolved as part of this Parkway project. First, the county saved time and money mitigating for the pool project and by transferring the long-term maintenance obligation for the site security and maintenance of the ecological values to the Yolo Habitat Conservancy, while still ensuring that the parcel remains available for public access. Next, the Yolo Habitat Conservancy saves time and money by utilizing our existing property, which was well suited for this type of restoration, instead of purchasing an easement or a new site in fee title. Third, the developer of the Cache Creek Casino Resort project, the Yochadehe Winton Nation Tribe, saved time and money by being able to transplant immediately, thus avoiding delays, potentially of up to a year, by being able to transplant within the federal elderberry transplant window. And then next, the gravel mining operator saved time and money by using the required reclamation of this property to create valuable hawk habitat and then reserving the right to use that habitat for future mitigation of impacts at other sites. Next, the nonprofit Cache Creek Conservancy will be able to monitor the site's ecological values into perpetuity and has access to a new open space location for its environmental education programs. And finally, the public wins by having access to restored open space with a sustainable long-term funding source, as well as the flood benefits I just described. As you can see, getting the Parkway Plan right the first time was crucial. So we knew we needed the right experts to assist us. And that's where Ben and his team at CALA came in. I'd like to turn it over to Ben now to talk with you about how the plan came together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elisa. So as was mentioned, when we brought in, we started looking at what does this vision want to be? You know, so much work was put into the planning and into all the planning documents by Heidi and the group early to do great reclamation plans. You can already see the few projects that have been finished that Elisa were talking about. It was already a success on individual project basis, but the challenge then becomes, how do you communicate the vision of this whole area, especially when really all you're looking at is maps, very technical maps, holes in the ground, and a bunch of mining equipment. And so it was a big challenge of ours to change the perception of what this is. This is the overall map of the region. You can see the properties indicated, whether it's in color or in white. The colored properties are all the ones that are going to come into the county's control at some point after mining's done, and the white ones are future mining projects that still need to be worked out along the Cache Creek corridor. So first of all, for us, was to understand the scope and size of the project. And as we look at these properties, you can even see dates on them because they're going to come to the county at different times. So it's so important to look at this as in the timeline of this past, present, and future. And then how do we start building that vision, and what are we trying to communicate to everybody involved? Why is this of value to folks? So of course, we always start out with big goals, and a lot of them have already been mentioned because they were already baked into the planning documents. From us as Park and Rec planners, what was important is, like the bullet point 2, develop a comprehensive trail system. That's the best way to link these up. Like if any of you have been along the American River Parkway, you can see trails link up everything. So that's a perfect thing to start linking these spaces together. A couple more bullet points down, providing guidance regarding additional lands to target. Once we start placing this together, how do we then target other lands we need to dedicate or acquire along the way? And then down at the bottom, always looking towards great wildlife and habitat reserves, because that's a lot of what drives these types of projects. So once again, as we started understanding all these individual reclamation plans, there's a lot of information that was there. All the requirements were set up ahead of time, and then the miners agreed, and then the miners got these approved, and then they're mining, and then at some point this plan is going to be implemented. So we had to dig in and find out what the plan was. And what's great is they already have teams of very good biologists, scientists, ecologists that are putting these plans together so that it's transitioned over as a viable ecosystem and has some public access components already built in because of this net gains complex. So we went through and dug in and started finding all those different things we need to look at, these opportunity areas. Then, super important, Heidi and Elisa said, hey, before you do anything, Ben, you and your team have got to come out and tour these sites. And so this is our first impressions. You're going through these orchards, walking out, and then all of a sudden this big hole appears with this great vista where you're looking down in it, and all this wetland has been created, these oak woodlands have been created, and it's all a viable habitat that's even being maintained currently. So from my perspective as a public access and open space, I was just like, wow, these are great opportunities. So we needed to start mapping these and start capturing these and understanding what the sense of place is that's being developed. As we toured the site as a group, we started looking at access roads and linkages, adjacent uses, identifying opportunities, constraints on all these properties. Because if you think about it, as I showed you on the map, there were all these little individual jewels. So how do we start linking these jewels together? And it really becomes the public access component that's the key. And then we started deciding how are we going to map it, or how are we going to capture all this information. And you could imagine, most of you have done similar types of plans at scales, you could spend a lot of money master planning each one of these sites. And as we know, these plans need to be flexible because things change. So we worked as a group to come up with a very simple system of symbols and graphics to help communicate what you have, what's the present when the mining is done, and what are future opportunities or recreation opportunities. And so when you see orange, orange is all the existing opportunities that are there. And then purple, and symbology like the purple, is showing future opportunities. How can we connect these to others? So in this case, this is Cape A open space. It's already a park that's been reclaimed. It's already has public access. The county's already using it. And you can see above it, the label where it says Granite Cape A Lake. That's a future property right now that's still being mined. So when we looked at this site, you can see the big orange arrow. This is a trail, but it doesn't go anywhere right now because the properties to the right aren't done yet. So we looked at each one of these individual properties and then started linking them up. The other thing it did is, by visiting the sites that have already been built, we start getting a flavor of what's the aesthetic of this park, what's the unique personality of this Cache Creek Parkway. And it does have a much more rural feel than a lot of other systems, right? There's already a lot of gravel paths and a lot of native planting, great signage. There's a lot of good environmental education already going on. And it kind of gave us an idea as Park and Rec planners what the future vision of this parkway would be. It's unlike any other, which is important. And then we started mapping out the opportunities, constraints, looking at things that are challenges to the site, like illegal public access, and looking at potential futures like, can we camp at this site? And we started enumerating this in the plan. So these are pages that come right out of the plan. And to go along with the symbology images, so instead of drawing a boat launch, we just put a symbol there with a picture so folks can see, hey, that's what the boat launch is going to look like. So when Elisa is trying to build on a certain site, she has her cost and she has a photo of what a restroom looks like so she can communicate to folks, this is what I want, without having to spend a lot of time drawing up plans. So we use this same symbology throughout all the sites. And then we started looking at new additional recreation opportunities that are appropriate for these sites. I mean, long-term, what is the draw? If we want to keep bringing in money and keep bringing in people or having places for people to go when they're on these trails, we already have great habitat resources. What about recreation resources? And we started looking at things that would be appropriate to add to sites. And as you can see, a lot of these are not really expensive, like fitness stations, running trails, even disc golf. These aren't real expensive uses, but they take a lot of land. And that's what we have a lot of in the valley, in a lot of these areas. We have a lot of space to do some cool things that you couldn't do in more urban type of environments along public access trails. And then we started looking at other sites that are the future. These are the future sites. You can see on the aerial, it's still just an orchard and some farmland, but it's going to turn into this big lake. So, you know, when it finally is done, what is it going to look like? And so we use simple colors to say, hey, here's how big the lake is going to be. And then you have this neat little ribbon of habitat and maybe some trails around the perimeter. And then we took that lake, Granite Esparto Lake, and when you put it on the map next to these other facilities, you start seeing, hey, these are adjacent to. So we realized the Granite Esparto Lake is next to the Granite Esparto Trail, which is next to the Granite Esparto Lake. And so these linkages start happening and we start seeing this vision of what a parkway could start turning into. So then we started zooming out on the large scale, and you can still see at the top there where Granite Esparto Lake is, and over to the left, you can see the Cape Park. Those are two of the pieces, but we have a bunch of these along this whole corridor. So by mapping at a larger scale, we can use orange to say, hey, here's trails that we're gonna have, but then there's areas where we wanna have a trail, and then we started showing those with purple. So as each one of these property owners starts coming to the county and starts wanting approvals, we can start adding in open public access to those plans. The other thing it did is start showing our gaps where we have property owners that don't want public access and have no trespassing signs up, gaps where roads no longer even work. Or even in some cases, a bridge has been given to the county, but they don't have rights to the other side of the bridge. So how can we start using these gaps as negotiating tools with the mining companies and other property owners to start getting public access wherever it possibly makes sense? And also utilizing things that we have. Mining tunnels could be great public access tunnels, so Heidi doesn't have to walk on the road like you see on the left image. You know, to cross over to another property, wouldn't it be great to get under the highway without having to cross it up at the surface? And then even down to the trail surfaces, you know, should parts be paved, like in Puda Creek at the bottom, or more gravel, like already happens at Cape? When we have definite ADA access, we need to have more developed, like this ramp that's going right down to the creek. It's a really cool amenity where you can take a wheelchair right down into the creek bed. So then we started compiling this all together, and then we needed to go out to the community to start selling this as a plan. Because if you could imagine, from the political point of view, you start getting nervous when you say, wow, we're getting this land, we're getting this piece of property, we're getting this piece of property. What are we going to do all this? And so Heidi and Elisa knew, hey, this was supposed to be this big vision, but it was hard to communicate that vision. And so by mapping this all out and giving it an identity, you already are making it a thing. And so the term we worked with, the working term is this Cache Creek Parkway Plan. And you can see the symbol in the middle. And we worked on this branding or this symbology, which is a powerful tool we use on a lot of our projects, like you see these other examples. So whenever you're talking to people, you can say, oh, it's the Cache Creek Parkway Plan. And it's a thing then. Instead of all these little tiny properties, it's a whole vision. It's also super important to get people out at the site. Get them outside, get them touring the site. See what these resources are. That's super important for people to get ownership on it, right? So whenever we're going in the public outreach process, we use our staff as the advocates. We use stakeholder agencies as individual groups we end up meeting with. We use the end users or the people, the community, to help steer direction of what we want out there. And then we use flexibility in these plans to manage expectation. What's neat about just using symbols and lines is all these things can change depending on how these outreach processes go. And all along, we used a lot of images to help show what the future project will look like, to help people really visualize, wow, this is what it's going to look like. So what's neat is the Cache Creek Nature Preserve at the bottom right's already built. This is what it could look like. There's other projects like Quarry Lakes Rec Area in Fremont where you can see what these large lakes will be when you have public access to it. Or we even tell some of the miners, if you're not using the equipment anymore, some of it could stay and become educational or integral with the designs, like you see the steel stacks in Pennsylvania in their project. Or other types of uses, depending on your project. You may have a quarry instead of a rock. There's some great adventure parks like you see up in Rockland where they're reusing quarries as these great areas, or Granite Regional Park in Sacramento where they put their skate parks and other uses down in what's left down there. Or along Puda Creek where the whole rail trestle was left and it's an educational opportunity along the creek. There's just endless amounts of opportunities that we can uncover at these sites. Because ultimately, what's the success? The success is finding this great balance between habitat and conservation to public and public access, getting our kids out there. I can't believe now so much has changed in just the last year because of COVID, where if you go along any of your spaces now, open spaces, you will see children out in nature. They're tired of being cooped up. You'll see them in the creek. This is a pretty recent photograph. So that's when we know we have success. Or even in the upper right, who knew in the last couple of years the newest thing in cycling will become gravel riding? So we were fretting on our plan, shouldn't all these trails be paved? And now we realize, wow, this would be an awesome opportunity to have all these gravel pavements for e-bikes and gravel bikes to access all these different facilities. So the point being, keeping the success or that vision always in mind when you're planning these spaces.